So this is, some of you who've lived in New York or traveled to New York might be familiar with the B&H Dairy Luncheonette on 2nd Avenue. Or next image.
Oops, sorry. There we go.
Or you might remember Ratner's. This is the one on Delancey Street. There was another one on 2nd Avenue. Wait, oh, sorry, you can go ahead, thanks. And these were the last well-known examples of a kind of restaurant that reached its height of popularity in the early 20th century. Next. And these restaurants catered to the approximately 2 million Eastern European Jews who came to America in that same period. And the dairy restaurant offered an amalgam of regional cuisines that developed over hundreds of years in Poland and Russia and Romania and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And some of them may have been original Jewish inventions. Some of them may have been adapted to comply with Jewish dietary law. As I said, that's a matter of study for food historians. Some Hasidim I've spoke with told me the only really Jewish food is a kugel, and things like kugels existed all over the place. So I don't know what the truth is about that. Next. One aspect of that dietary law forbid the mixing of milk and meat and resulted in a cuisine of dishes based upon dairy, vegetables, grains, and fish. Next. Such dishes as blintzes. Next. Cold beet borscht with sour cream. Next. Knishes. Next. And gefilte fish. Next. For people who no longer follow these dietary laws, the smell and taste of the food had an appeal of its own. That's a scene inside of the Delancey Street Ratner's. There's a waiter bringing a bowl of borscht with a boiled potato in it, and he's about to spill it on the lap of that customer. Next. In the process of uncovering the history of these restaurants through archival research and interviews, I came to understand their place in a larger history of institutions devised to feed travelers that goes back to antiquity. Next. The dairy restaurant could only come into existence when those ancient Jewish dietary laws encountered the invention of the restaurant, that unique institution of mid-18th century France. Next. Instead of offering a single dish of the day, the restaurant endeavored to feed people according to their individual biological needs and tastes. Diners could choose what they felt like eating from a large menu of different carefully prepared dishes or restaurants. And the word was the actual dish. Each one was a kind of restorative medicinal dish. Next. This is a sightseeing car somewhere on the Lower East Side in the early 20th century. So beyond the matters of culinary taste, choosing a restaurant or cafe in early 20th century New York became a social and political act. Restaurants and cafes on the Lower East Side catered, next, to socialists, next, anarchists, next, Orthodox Jews, next, and specific national cuisines. That's the famous Cymbalon player, Joseph Moskowitz, in a Romanian wine cellar. somewhere in New York on the Lower East Side. And these restaurants also appeal to the American public wanting to experience these exotic subcultures. Food choice could be a move toward assimilation or a wholesale rejection of the majority culture. Next. For some, meat eating was associated with the appetitive and aggressive behavior of the upper classes. That's supposed to be a scene in Delmonico's, one of the most expensive restaurants in New York. Next. Dairy restaurants also catered to a brand of vegetarianism associated with Leo Tolstoy and his Christian anarchist beliefs. And that's the spirit of Tolstoy walking up 2nd Avenue. Next. My history explores the pastoral impulse, that desire in the face of spreading industrialization and urban life to return to an unspoiled natural environment with its attendant healthful food and curative atmosphere. Next. From the Garden of Eden and Arcadia, next, to the public pleasure gardens of 18th century England, next, to the growth of health resorts and medicinal spas throughout Europe. That's Sholem Aleichem at Marienbad. He wrote a book that's set there. These are people taking the milk cure. Next. The same hunger for unspoiled lands incidentally led to the European conquest of much of the world. Next. The small, desperate restaurateurs who ran the hundreds of now forgotten dairy restaurants chronicled in my book were engaged in the hopeless task of offering the working and middle classes an opportunity to partake of the pastoral impulse within the four walls of a store and the commercial restraints of a brutal market economy. Next. For a contemporary vegan or anyone aware of the ruinous effects of industrialized animal-based food production, the history of the dairy restaurant may seem to involve quaint and meaningless distinctions. Next. The purpose for compiling this history, in part, is to remind us that the city, or New York City at least, that most cities were once composed of countless small businesses offering a wide range of idiosyncratically designed environments in which to eat while imbibing the political ideologies of your fellow diner, and that the serious business of feeding people was not driven solely by the desire to maximize profit. My book tries to unravel that complicated history of the dairy restaurant. Okay, we can go out of the slideshow and talk about these places. I don't know if there are any questions or comments about what I was talking about. I mean, the book goes into, it's a kind of Jewish history that sets Jews in the larger world, in the as the restaurants, the larger Christian world. And, these things didn't, in New York especially, didn't operate in a vacuum.
So we do actually have a few questions.
Okay.
The first one is, what would be the difference between an American dairy restaurant and an Eastern European one?
Oh, That's something I didn't mention in my little introduction, but the book has a large chapter on there was a kind of restaurant that developed um, between the pure food movement of the early 1900s and the movement against alcohol drinking. You know, just the thing that led to the temperance movement that led to the prohibition. And these were places called dairy lunch rooms or dairy restaurants. And what they featured was very fresh milk, usually directly shipped from a farm. And they had a small menu of dairy dishes, things like milk toast, which is just pieces of toast soaking in milk, and they had sour milk. Um, and the rest of the menu was kind of an early American luncheonette menu of meat and sandwiches and roasts and seafood, nothing to do with Jewish dietary law. But they were called dairy lunches and dairy restaurants, dairy lunchrooms. So that's the difference. The Eastern European versions of these dairy restaurants or dairy lunchrooms um, for both culinary and religious reasons, or one or the other, to varying degrees, observe the separation of milk and meat, and would just serve milk, grains, vegetables, and fish.
So another question, did dairy restaurants evolve from the coffee houses of Eastern Europe as social gathering spots?
There were many also dairy milk oriented restaurants throughout the history of Europe. In any country where people were able to drink, didn't have a milk intolerance. So Northern Europe, they were in Russia and Poland, Germany, Milchhallen. In Poland was a whole type of restaurant called a dairy, like lasagna, and I go into that in the book. But to say that the New York and American versions of these Jewish dairy restaurants had anything to do with those earlier forms is questionable, because most of the people who opened these places were modeling them on immediate models, and they might not have ever eaten in one of those restaurants. So just like all history, it doesn't follow, influences don't follow in a perfect linear line. Some of the people I interviewed who ran dairy restaurants in New York, who grew up in Poland and Russia, had never seen even a Jewish dairy restaurant. So it's a little, so to say that it influenced them is not fully, maybe they wouldn't have existed without them, but they didn't necessarily influence those owners, those restaurateurs. They were looking at immediate examples around them.
So
Anyway.
I'm sure this next one is in your book, but were there dairy restaurants in other cities like Denver, Chicago, Los Angeles?
Yeah. Wherever there was a sizable Jewish population, there were dairy restaurants. A few in Chicago, a handful in Los Angeles, and then when Miami became heavily a Jewish resort area, there were a few of them there. A lot in Newark, Philadelphia, the East Coast, I think, the majority of them, and most in New York. And if somebody opened one in Baltimore, they would tend to call it a New York style dairy. It actually was the name of one, the New York Dairy in Baltimore.
So were these restaurants found at health spas?
These health spas, places like Marienbad, they were all over Europe. They had restaurants, and some of them had vegetarian restaurants, and the spas that were frequented by Jews probably had vegetarian restaurants that would have offered something of a dairy menu. But I don't think I've discovered any that I have conclusive evidence about. The thing is, people in Poland, middle and upper middle class Jews, would be going to French-oriented restaurants. Some his travel writer said, if you want to eat Jewish food in Poland, you have to leave Warsaw. You have to go to Krakow. You won't find them in. He didn't know about these small neighborhood dairies, but so that's something that should be looked into. I know there were Jewish hotels at these spas, and how observant the hotel owner was would determine whether they segregated their dining rooms or how they dealt with dietary observance.
So what's the difference between a dairy restaurant and a deli?
A deli
I mean, other than
deals
meat.
mainly in meat, and in terms of atmosphere, that was the dominant Jewish form of restaurant, meat restaurants. I mean, there were many more delicatessens and meat-oriented restaurants than dairies. The dairy was the break. You'd go there for a break from the meat-eating world. And I try to explain this in the book, whether that was something you would do just because you had indigestion from eating too much meat, or you were a vegetarian, was a matter of individual decisions. But the atmospheres were very different. One was this there was a more repetitive atmosphere in the meat restaurants. And this is a subjective thing. I can't prove it, but just for me historically, when I went to these dairy restaurants, there was a smell of frying butter in the air, not pastrami, and those are very different atmospheres. I don't know if that answers the question.
So we have more questions. One is, what is your family history, and do you have family involved in the restaurant business?
No. Oh, well, my father was born in Warsaw, came to America in the 20s. My mother was just born in America. Her parents came from Kiev. And they were not in the restaurant business, but for a period of time, my father operated a place up in Saratoga Springs, a small kind of boarding, what's that? A small kind of boarding house, Jewish boarding house, catering to the readers of the Freiheit, which was the communist Yiddish paper. And he had to serve dinner, so they had a dining room. So I guess indirectly, I know I once met the son of a woman who was the cook at his restaurant. And I remember him telling me one night a week they would make something called American chop suey. And I mean, he wasn't an observant Jew, so they probably just went back and forth between one night dairy, one night meat. But I think his taste was deeply informed by Jewish dietary law. He would never mix the two, milk and meat, even though he wasn't an observant Jew. And that's a big part of culinary history. Whatever the reasons are, whatever these taboos, wherever they originate, people forget the origin of the taboo, but the taboo continues as a matter of taste, or mainly a matter of taste, yeah.
So how do rabbis fit into the picture?
At least in the New World, if you were selling dairy, you didn't need a mashgiach or certification. It was outside of that realm. New York State certified milk was certified as being from a cow, not from an animal whose milk you couldn't drink. But to an Orthodox Jew on the East Side, I know some of them wouldn't eat at the dairy garden. They didn't consider that someone was careful enough about what they were doing with food there. So it was very much dependent on your level of dietary observance and whether you trusted the owner of the restaurant. Now, most restaurants that cater to an observant Jewish audience do have certification. There's a rabbi going around certifying vegetarian restaurants, and he actually certified the B&H. And he does it almost for free because these restaurants would not otherwise bother, or they couldn't afford to have official certification. So I don't know. So some people look at that certificate and say it's worthless. So it's all a matter of who you're listening to and how much you care about that. But
so following up on that, when did kosher style evolve, and did it have any relevance to dairy cuisine specifically?
yeah, well, yeah, kosher style means a restaurant that serves Jewish cuisine of the world, of specifically, Eastern European. I'm dealing with, and in Miami Beach, they would have any menu, even menus of delicatessens might have blintzes on them, and they still do probably to this day. So they would be serving Jewish style cuisine, but not following any of these dietary laws. I mean, the kitchens in these places were largely in the later years staffed by Black and Puerto Rican people, and they were following the directions of the owner. Their concern was pretty minimal. So that's what's known as, I guess, Jewish style restaurants.
Another question, did the New York City restaurants advertise in the Jewish papers, in the mainstream papers, in both?
Yeah, that's one of the greatest sources of information about these restaurants is in the Yiddish press. And they would advertise, it seems, not necessarily along political lines or the lines of the paper, but if someone opened a restaurant, they'd want to attract as many people as they could. If it was a restaurant in the garment district, they might appeal to a particular garment union and say, have your meetings at our restaurant. If they advertised, in the Freiheit, it would be advertised as a place to have dinner with your comrades. And did they advertise less in the English papers? I'm trying to think. Most of the advertising I saw was in the Yiddish press. But I think a place like Steinberg's was big enough to run ads in the Times. So depending on how big they might have an ad in the Times too. But mainly the smaller places that were aimed at that first generation audience would advertise in the Yiddish press.
So there's also a question about well-known dairy restaurants in the Diamond District.
Right.
And were they ever in Bintelbrief?
Well, first question about there was a great dairy lunchroom on the second floor of one of the Diamond exchanges toward Fifth Avenue. It was called the Diamond Dairy. And you could sit there overlooking, the activity in the trading floor. And yeah, it was, I mean, in my experience, it was one of the last places in New York, restaurants in New York, where you could almost be sure to hear Yiddish spoken in public. And that's now gone. The Bintel Brief, one of the restaurants that I showed you a picture of, Gus Menger's restaurant, I think his name was. It was mentioned in the Bintel. No, you know what? It was mentioned in the forwards in the column looking for missing husbands. It was a kind of a place where people were dropping off contact notes if someone had seen their husband. So not in the Bintel Brief. I don't think I haven't read that column exhaustively, so I didn't see any, but possible they're there. There's a website I've put up called Dairy Restaurant History, where I'd like to collect, additions to the book and corrections. I mean, a book like this with thousands of bits of information, there must be lots of strange little errors. I've caught one or two. So if you have any memories to share, go to that website. It's one word, dairyrestauranthistory.com, and there's a contact email.
Is it restaurants plural or singular?
I think singular. Dairy Restaurant History. I think that, look it up, wait.
Yeah, so singular. Here's a good question. What was your favorite dairy restaurant?
I think I guess my favorite was the Garden Dairy on East Broadway. That was on the corner of the block where the Forward building was, down the street from the Educational Alliance. And the reason I liked that one is because it was a cafeteria mainly, and it was very lively in the evening. And I was at the Educational Alliance every Friday night for several years. There was an organization of figurative painters that met there. So I would have dinner at the Garden Dairy with a friend before that, and we'd go to the meeting. And I remember the food being really good.
So someone else asked, when did Ratner's close, and is B&H the only one still open in New York?
I'm terrible with somebody who wrote a history book. I'm terrible. I can't remember the exact date when Ratner's closed. I could look it up. And no, the B&H, it's one of the few of Eastern European oriented ones left in Manhattan. But if you go to Williamsburg, Brooklyn, there are several. There's a good one called Green and Ackerman's in Williamsburg, and there are a few other small ones. But these places Ackerman's and Green's has been there a long time. Some of the others come and go. And if you go to any Jewish neighborhood in Borough Park, you'll find some dairies still. But technically, every kosher pizzeria is a dairy restaurant. They don't serve meat, but they're more oriented toward the Mediterranean and Israel, their menu. So those exist all over the place.
So here is a longer question. Was there a connection between the development of the demand for fish in New York and the supply of fish from Michigan and the Great Lakes via the Erie Canal? Apparently the fishing industry around here was a largely Jewish business in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So were they exporting to New York?
There was a big fish market, in New York, the Fulton Fish Market. So, and I know those were where this fish was caught. the fresh fish, um, I think for most New York restaurants, it would have channeled through the Fulton Fish Market. That's in the morning. Uh, the wholesalers would be there for restaurants. But so I don't know what that connection is with the Great Lakes. Um, uh, but that's, a lot of this book is not about food, strangely enough, even though it's about restaurant culture. And I don't deeply go into the milk industry or the fish industry. That's like, the book would be thousands of pages long if I did that. More about um, the impulses behind and the problems around eating out the Jews. So I don't know, but if you know anything about it, send it to me. I'll put it on the web. Start a section of the website about fish. I mean, the old herring and smoked fish businesses, Acme, those were based out in Brooklyn, and there was some on the east side, I'm sure.
So we have a question about Russ and Daughters. Is it a restaurant or a grocery store?
Well, now they have a restaurant, I think. I haven't been there, but I think they opened one nearby. Some early dairy restaurants were these hybrid bakeries, and if you put a few chairs in a bakery and you serve food and you don't have meat on your available in a bakery, you might have knishes and then maybe even sour milk, like um, knish place like Yonah Schimmel's. It's sort of, you could say it's a bakery that put a few chairs and tables in it. And I remember Girdle's Bakery had a few chairs on the lower table. So I guess if you put a few chairs in an appetizing store, like the one up on the Upper West Side, I think they do have some meat now. They're not a very observant, but anyway, yeah, there are these hybrids between appetizing stores, bakeries, and when you call it a restaurant or a lunchroom. At some point, the restaurant business would dominate selling food over a counter, for takeout, I guess.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. The Belen Sensei, I seem to remember a dairy restaurant years ago in Toronto at the end of Yonge Street. Do you know the name and
Yeah.
are they still there? It's like trivia night.
I think it was United Bakers, and they were downtown, but then they moved out to into the Jewish suburbs. I have to try to find it. Hold on. I don't know if yeah, United Bakers. They were on Agnes Street originally, and then they moved to Spadina. So yeah, there may have been others. I only found that one in a place called Bagel King Coffee Shop on Eglinton Avenue, and also in Toronto. But I'm sure there are ones I didn't find. I mean, I keep discovering them. I think I identified from 1890 till, the 1980, about 200 across North America and, well, these pre-American ones too. So yeah, I'm sure there must have been ones in Toronto that I don't have. So I mean, I don't know if you want to, and if people want to go on to have dinner. I'm not in a hurry to go, but it's up to you, up to my host.
Oh no, I mean we've got time.
Do you have any more questions?
I think I've covered all of them. I'm just checking. Oh, we've got a new question. When does he speak Yiddish?
My Yiddish has gotten much better, but mainly for reading purposes, because I was looking through lots of papers, newspapers. And every night I try to read a few pages in Yiddish. But I don't have really anyone here to speak to. So I don't know why you'd want to hear me speak Yiddish. So this is definitely, and that's the other thing I miss. It was not only the end of working class Jewish restaurants, but it's sort of the end of places where you could hear people speak Yiddish. And the other thing I liked about them is that they didn't, like most ethnic restaurants, didn't try to evoke an ethnic decor, because Jews lived all over Eastern Europe. Some of the Hungarians and Romanians tried to evoke Hungarian and Romanian decor. But the dairy restaurant, I think the decor, this kind of clean stainless steel, formica, and tile, was influenced by the dairy milking room, this kind of sanitary environment. And so the combination of Yiddish-speaking Jews in this or internationalist, non-ethnic decor appealed to me.
So first of all, we have one of our partners at the Cohen Haddow Center for Jewish Studies wants you to know that she does speak some Yiddish if you get bored. Oh. And I suspect we probably have several Yiddish speakers around town. And also, you may have heard this, but the Yiddish Book Center up in near Amherst, they're doing a lot of online classes now. But back to the questions. How did you get started with pen and ink, and do you use other media as well?
Watercolor, yeah. Pen, ink, and watercolor. That's sort of black watercolor diluted into a gray. But yeah, that's my main. I really don't like art materials too much, so try to keep them pretty limited. Oh, there's a great, if you're interested in Yiddish, there's a great festival every around Christmas time in New York, Yiddish New York. If you Google that, the kind of the closest thing to a Jewish community in my world, and a kind of community I can identify with.
Well, how did you settle though on that watercolor medium as opposed to markers or something else?
Oh, it's an old people in the Italian Renaissance and later 18th century, people did their quick sketches with ink, black or sepia ink, and watercolor is the most utilitarian and efficient way to evoke light. And so I was very influenced by Italian painting. It's probably a bigger, or as big an influence as Jewish culture on me, the Italian world. Italian picture making.
Also about process, did you find that you were writing your book at a different time of day than you would usually write and draw your cartoons? Or was it the same sort of? Yeah, did you have like, okay, in the morning I'll do my cartoons, in the afternoon I'll do my book, or something like that?
No, I'm not that organized, but this book was written over decades. It was compiled very slowly. I think the contract might have been 20 years ago, signed 20 years ago. So books that take that long to be delivered usually never happen. I was looking into that. I mean, after 10 years, if a book is not delivered, it tends never to be delivered. So this took longer, not because I was working on it all the time, but the method of my working is this, the milchdike approach to writing history is ruminating over things and following kind of what seem like pointless leads that might lead to something. So it wasn't written in the way that a professional historian would approach writing a book. And I went through several editors at Next Books that came and went, and they were very patient. They knew this wasn't a topical book, since most of this kind of specifically Eastern European dairy restaurant is gone. There was no hurry to finish it, so I was never hurried. Yeah, I would work on it when I discovered things, and sometimes I couldn't. You wouldn't know where to look, and it involved languages I don't speak, and trying to research in Polish and Russian, so that became complicated. But so one thing that happened is I would say, within the last 10 years, it became very obvious the environmental degradation of the earth. I grew up with Silent Spring, so this idea was in my mind since I was a child. But in the last 10 years, the idea of the earth being anything but even the possibility of a paradise on earth seemed like hopeless. And that kind of informed the beginning and the end of the book. The idea that these restaurants were little miniature models of a kind of indoor, a walled paradise, which is what paradise means. It's a walled garden. And so I thought the worse the world gets, the more relevant, in a way, a book about paradise becomes. And then, I don't know, 3 years ago, I think I read the World Health Organization said we should be preparing for a pandemic. It's just inevitable. And, that's even more of a ruined condition of the earth, whether it's related to the degradation of the ecosystem. That probably is all tied in. So I can't say I planned the book to come out on the week of a pandemic, but that's how it worked out.
So, sorry.
No, somebody I think said something about marketing.
Yeah, so someone was asking how you're managing to market the book right now. And then someone else asked, beyond having been to these places, did you go photograph these places yourself, or what was your sort of image source material?
There are some very few photographs, and if there are, they're of the outside. So a lot of this is like reconstructive archaeology. And the ones I knew firsthand, it was based on these fading memories. I tried to reconstruct them from memory. The ones that I'd never gone to, that was a complete piece of, I could look at a restaurant that wasn't a dairy and sort of try to imagine, or bakeries. I knew there were these hybrid kind of restaurant fixtures that I could evoke. So yeah, it's like any reconstructive urban archaeology. And as far as marketing, this is not a comic strip or a graphic novel. It's a heavily illustrated text. I think there's definitely an image on almost every page. So there must be about 500 drawings in this book. But it's not at all being marketed to the comics or graphic novel world. And my work is not very popular in that world. It tends to be read by people who read it despite the fact that it's a comic. You know, they're just not comic fans. So it's selling very well despite the pandemic. And because I know they're printed, I don't know how this is affecting books that have to be printed. I don't know if printing is considered an essential service. So maybe books that are not out yet are going to be held up. But this book was printed by March 10th. So the books are out there in some warehouse. Whether they're shipping them, I don't know. But it's selling better than most of my books. And that's, I think, because it's reaching an audience that's interested in restaurant culture and Jewish history.
I do have a few people saying they did get copies, so that's good.
I see it available online.
Yeah.
Ingrams, the book distributor, has connections with local independent bookstores, so you could support your closed neighborhood bookstore by buying it through that system. And I think if you buy it through that system, they send me a book plate that I can autograph with a drawing of a blintz, and then they'll send it to you.
Oh, well, if you could send a link to that, I will definitely post that, because our local bookstores here in Metro Detroit are shut down and not doing online orders at the moment. So
I'll send you that link. Yeah,
that would be great.
There are, I know stores are doing that, and they're
Great.
doing pretty well because of it.
So another question, after finishing such a monumental book, do you see yourself returning to shorter projects like Our Mental Age, etc.?
The next book, just because I have a contract to make it, is a collection of a series called Hotel and Farm. That's a strip I did several years ago. 1 week was about hotel culture. The next week was about agriculture. It alternated, and it ran for about 2 years. So I'm just making a long story that kind of wraps up the whole world of that between hotels and agriculture. So that's the next book. But I mean, I think about all kinds of crackpot projects. I don't think I can live long enough to do a book that takes this long to make, but I could do shorter, and maybe now I would know how to do it faster. I mean, there's a way to do it. I explain in the book when I describe this project to people, and you know how vast it is. It's a kind of world history. They said, well, hire a few graduate students who are working in those fields and have them research the fields, and you could put the book together very quickly. And I didn't do that. I purposely wanted to take this more ruminative or milichtic approach to writing this history. I think it would have been a different book. Once you bring experts in, it becomes a different thing. This is my completely, you know, strangely informed take on world history. And I think you have to take it as that. Anyway.
Okay, well, we definitely look forward to your next crackpot project. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Tuning in.
I want to say thank you to our sponsors, the Cohn Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State, the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan, the Detroit Institute of Arts, and all of our friends and partners. Thank you for helping us to bring programming to you.